Sometimes the absence of evidence becomes its own form of evidence, and David's confrontation with his wife Priya about her emotional affair would reveal how words themselves can become weapons when trust has been shattered. His demand that she stop claiming innocence and instead acknowledge the gaps in what could be proven would expose the fragile line between truth and reasonable doubt in a marriage hanging by a thread. Language precision matters most when relationships are at their breaking point, and David found himself parsing his wife's defensive statements with the scrutiny of a prosecuting attorney. Her repeated insistence that she never had sex with him felt less like reassurance and more like a carefully constructed legal defense that revealed as much through its specificity as it concealed through its limitations. Emotional affairs often exist in the gray areas of human connection, where inappropriate boundaries are crossed without necessarily involving physical intimacy. David had discovered Priya's months-long exchange of not decent, not sexual messages with a junior colleague through WhatsApp and Instagram, creating a relationship that violated their marriage while potentially stopping short of outright infidelity. The discovery process had followed a familiar pattern of denial, minimization, and eventual partial admission that many betrayed spouses recognize. Priya initially defended her behavior before acknowledging wrongdoing and promising to end the inappropriate relationship, setting the stage for the complex negotiations that follow such revelations. David's decision to wait for Priya to voluntarily update him on ending the relationship demonstrated both patience and a test of her commitment to transparency. Her excuse that she and her colleague were coming at different days to office so she could not meet him revealed either genuine logistical challenges or convenient avoidance of an uncomfortable conversation. The repeated emphasis Priya placed on having never had romantic feelings for her colleague and never had sex with him suggested a defensive strategy focused on minimizing the severity of her actions rather than acknowledging their impact on David. This framing attempted to control the narrative by establishing specific boundaries around what had not occurred, rather than taking full responsibility for what had. When someone repeatedly emphasizes what they didn't do rather than acknowledging what they did do, what does this reveal about their understanding of the situation and their commitment to rebuilding trust? David's growing frustration with Priya's defensive posture led him to demand direct action rather than continued excuses. His insistence that she call her colleague in front of me to bring closure represented an attempt to regain control over a situation where he had felt powerless and excluded from decisions affecting his marriage. The supervised phone call that followed revealed the complex dynamics of ending inappropriate relationships while trying to maintain professional civility. Priya's approach, telling her colleague to stop chatting as her husband saw the chats, positioned David as the suspicious outsider rather than acknowledging the appropriateness of his concerns or the wrongness of their behavior. The colleague's response, "I'm sorry, I only talked like a friend," demonstrated the same minimization strategy that Priya had employed, framing their inappropriate relationship as innocent friendship rather than acknowledging how their behavior had crossed boundaries. David's anger at being portrayed as a suspicious husband rather than a rightfully concerned spouse revealed one of the secondary injuries that often accompany infidelity: being made to feel unreasonable for having reasonable concerns about obviously inappropriate behavior. His observation that Priya would rather be polite with a guy who almost ended her marriage than be honest about the severity of their relationship highlighted a common dynamic where unfaithful spouses seem more concerned with protecting their affair partner's feelings than addressing their betrayed spouse's pain. Priya's continued insistence that she didn't have sex with him in response to David's criticism demonstrated how this phrase had become her primary defense mechanism, used to deflect accountability rather than engage with the actual issues David was raising about trust, boundaries, and respect. How do you respond when someone uses technical truth to avoid emotional accountability? Can a relationship heal when one partner focuses on what didn't happen rather than addressing what did happen? David's sharp response, "Don't make it look like an achievement, you are just months or weeks away from that," cut through Priya's defensive framing to address the trajectory of her behavior rather than its current status. His words recognized that emotional affairs often serve as stepping stones to physical ones, making her emphasis on what hadn't happened yet both irrelevant and temporary. His suggested reframing, "Tell that your husband didn't get any evidence of you indulging in physical affair," brilliantly exposed the difference between claiming innocence and acknowledging the limitations of what could be proven. This distinction forced recognition that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly when trust has been violated. The resort trip that David referenced as context added another layer of complexity to their trust issues, revealing a pattern of behavior where Priya made decisions that appeared suspicious or inappropriate without considering how they might affect David's confidence in their relationship. 8 months earlier, Priya had requested permission to attend a colleague's wedding in another city, a request that David had approved, though apparently not with the enthusiasm she had expected. Her dissatisfaction with his response suggested underlying tensions about autonomy, control, and mutual consideration in their marriage. The revelation that Priya had actually gone to a resort with 3 male and 1 female colleague for activities like rafting, sailing, etc., the day before the wedding created a situation that was either innocent but poorly communicated or potentially problematic and deliberately concealed. Priya's explanation that she never asked about it, so she never told, and that her mom and sisters know about it, demonstrated a communication pattern where important information was shared with her family of origin but not her husband, suggesting divided loyalties or a lack of understanding about appropriate transparency in marriage. Should spouses be required to explicitly ask for information about their partner's activities? Or should transparency be automatically provided? How do family loyalties affect marital transparency? David's original anger about the resort trip had focused on permission and communication rather than suspicion of cheating. But the subsequent discovery of Priya's emotional affair had recontextualized that earlier incident through a lens of distrust and suspicion. His acknowledgement that he "don't have evidence of what you did at that resort," while noting that "it's human nature to protect their friends, so I won't even ask them as they will cover for you," revealed sophisticated understanding of how affairs are concealed, and how social networks often protect their members through loyalty or willful blindness. David's admission that he "know there is a high chance she didn't engage in physical cheating at the resort," combined with his statement that he wanted to hurt her for the hurt she caused, demonstrated the complex mixture of rational assessment and emotional retaliation that characterizes many responses to infidelity. This honest admission raised important questions about the ethics of weaponizing uncertainty and using reasonable doubt as a tool for inflicting emotional pain on someone who has already acknowledged wrongdoing and expressed commitment to change. The question of whether David had gone over the line and behaved like an asshole reflected his own awareness that his response might have been disproportionate or unfair, even while being understandable given his circumstances. Is it acceptable to use uncertainty and lack of evidence as weapons against someone who has betrayed your trust? How do you balance the desire for emotional retaliation with the need for constructive resolution? The fundamental issue David identified, that Priya was treating her lack of physical infidelity as an achievement rather than a minimum expectation, exposed a deeper problem about moral standards and relationship expectations that extended beyond the specific incident. His insight that emotional affairs often progress to physical ones within months or weeks reflected a realistic understanding of how inappropriate relationships typically escalate, making Priya's current technical innocence a poor predictor of future behavior without significant changes in boundaries and accountability. The power dynamic revealed in their interactions showed David attempting to regain control and force acknowledgement of reality, while Priya employed defensive strategies designed to minimize her culpability and maintain as much of her narrative as possible. The linguistic battle over how to describe Priya's behavior, innocent friendship versus emotional affair, lack of evidence versus proven innocence, illustrated how language itself becomes contested territory when trust has been violated and both parties are trying to establish the authoritative version of events. David's frustration with being cast as the suspicious husband reflected a common experience among betrayed spouses who find themselves having to prove the reasonableness of their concerns to the very person who created those concerns through their inappropriate behavior. The resort incident's transformation from a communication issue to a trust issue demonstrated how past events can be reinterpreted through new information, creating retrospective suspicion about previously accepted explanations. How do you distinguish between reasonable caution based on new information and paranoid reinterpretation of past events? Can previous incidents be fairly re-evaluated in light of discovered betrayals? Priya's pattern of sharing important information with her birth family while withholding it from David suggested either cultural differences about family hierarchy or personal choices about where primary loyalty and communication belonged, both of which had implications for their marriage's health and future. The colleagues' dismissive response during the supervised call, treating their relationship as mere friendship despite its obvious inappropriateness, revealed either genuine delusion about the nature of their connection or calculated minimization designed to avoid consequences. David's demand for precision in language, distinguishing between claiming innocence and acknowledging lack of evidence, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how truth and perception operate differently and how both matter in rebuilding trust after betrayal. The emotional retaliation David admitted to engaging in by weaponizing the resort incident represented an understandable but potentially destructive response that prioritized immediate emotional satisfaction over long-term relationship repair. His self-reflection about whether he had behaved like an asshole suggested awareness that justified anger doesn't automatically justify all expressions of that anger, and that rebuilding trust requires both partners to engage constructively rather than destructively. Can relationships recover when both partners are more focused on winning arguments than on rebuilding trust? How do you channel justified anger into constructive rather than destructive responses? The story illustrated how infidelity creates not just trust issues, but communication problems, where every statement becomes analyzed for hidden meanings and every defense becomes suspect, making honest dialogue increasingly difficult even when both parties claim to want resolution. David's experience highlighted the exhausting nature of policing language and parsing statements for accuracy when fundamental trust has been broken, creating a dynamic where both partners become adversaries in what should be a collaborative healing process. The question of proportionality, whether David's response was appropriate given Priya's acknowledged wrongdoing, reflected broader issues about justice, forgiveness, and the appropriate consequences for emotional betrayal in marriage. Priya's defensive strategy of emphasizing what hadn't happened rather than fully acknowledging what had happened demonstrated a common pattern where unfaithful spouses try to control the narrative by establishing the minimum possible definition of wrongdoing rather than taking full responsibility for the maximum possible impact. The underlying issue wasn't really about whether Priya had engaged in physical infidelity, but about whether she was approaching their recovery with full honesty, complete accountability, and genuine understanding of how her actions had affected David and their marriage. Is partial truth sufficient for rebuilding trust, or does recovery require complete transparency, even about events that might technically be considered irrelevant? How do you rebuild trust when one partner is focused on minimizing while the other is seeking full disclosure? David's story ultimately illustrated the complex interplay between truth, evidence, and trust in marriage, showing how technical accuracy can coexist with emotional dishonesty, and how the absence of proof can become its own source of ongoing suspicion and pain. His struggle represented the broader challenge faced by many betrayed spouses: who must navigate between reasonable caution and destructive paranoia, between justified anger and unfair retaliation, and between the desire for certainty and the reality that some questions may never be definitively answered. The resolution of their conflict would ultimately depend not on establishing absolute certainty about past events, but on whether both partners could commit to the transparency, accountability, and mutual respect necessary to rebuild trust going forward, regardless of what could or couldn't be proven about what had already occurred.